Your question about why are we born into a crappy world, really? Yeah. Let's grab the mic. So, yeah.
Basically, the problem I'm having with it is in my lack of wisdom, and I'm thinking like, okay, let's incarnate souls. Maybe I would incarnate them on a 6th level of the spirit world or something like that, and they don't have to be incarnated on the 1st level. So and their teachers to be other people from the 1st level, and also on top of that they have to like pull all the emotions from their parents and like surroundings and all the previous generations. So
so to solve this particular problem, if you think about trying to solve the problem, it's very complicated to solve the problem. Firstly, God did put the first human couple in a 6th sphere state on the earth. They were in a 6th sphere state on earth. They arrived on earth in a 6th sphere state, and the earth itself was in a 6th sphere state. So the actual spiritual environment of the earth when the first human couple arrived was in a 6th sphere state. So that in itself should indicate to us that God did what God felt was best, which was put the couple in the best possible environment for their education. Right? Now, let's divorce the physical reality from the spirit world reality for a moment, because there's reasons why God put them in a physical earth rather than in a spirit earth, right? Because there are places in the spirit world where they could have been placed, right? But that would have stopped them having the opportunity to have children. Do you understand? And God wanted an automatic process to occur for the incarnation of children. And the only way for that to occur was for the parents to create the 2 bodies rather than God doing it anymore. So originally, God always does the most economical thing. The most economical thing was to incarnate the first 2 people on an earth, create their spirit body and their material body, but design in their material body and their ability to create another spirit body and a material body through the process of sexual intercourse. God wanted wanted you to have the experience of having children. Now that's for your education. God wanted that for your education. There's a lot of things you learn by having children. You learn what it's like to be a parent, right? You learn what it's like to love somebody and they don't love you back. You learn what it's like to give to them and they don't give anything back. You learn a lot of things about love being a gift if you have children. So God wanted you to have the experience of having children. It's also the most economical thing for you to create the body of the next incarnation, of the next incarnating souls. So God wanted you to have that experience. Now, in the process of giving you that experience, which is part of your education, he also knew there were going to be potential problems with it, which he designed the laws to fix. So he put together a whole heap of laws that redeem you from making mistakes, can stop you from making mistakes. Those laws, of course, require some level of sensitivity. Now, he created the laws in many levels. You could divide the laws in terms of, there is a hierarchy of law, but you could also say he divided the laws into some specific areas of your life. So you could say there's the physical area of your life. In other words, he defined laws that control how fast your limbs grow, the shape and size of them. There's mathematics that defines what your face looks like, what your arms and legs look like, why your internal organs come about. Many of them are genetically controlled, but also there's mathematics built into those genetics so that you end up in certain proportions, so you're not looking out of proportion. Your body has been designed in such a way that it is proportional to some mathematical formulas, which, by the way, many things in nature are also proportional to. And God designed those laws to control your physical development and also your physical life. So he designed a law like the law of gravity, which controls you staying on the planet rather than flying off of it. He did all of that so that you could have an experience. So his purpose for these laws was so that you could have a personal experience over time and learn. And he created like the perfect like school, but it's also the perfect like world for us to come into in order to learn a lot of things. So you could say the things we learn are physical, and then generally the next level of learning we have is sexual in nature. Like, so by the time we're entering into our teenage years, we start developing sexually. So that causes us to trigger many desires in the soul that weren't there prior, and some of those desires are to find the other half. In other words, the desire for romance in your life. So he created these responses that occur in your body but also in your soul so that you can learn about romance, about love. So he designed these things too. And he created a whole heap of laws that govern those as well. And then he also created a whole set of laws that govern primarily your soul, the human soul itself, how you experience things through an emotional process. So you imagine if you had no emotions at all. It's hard to imagine. But imagine you have no emotions. I know humans are trying to have no emotions, but that's different to not having any. So imagine there's no emotions. So you've never in your entire life had a feeling of romance. You've never in your entire life had a feeling of love. Never in your entire life had a feeling of kindness. Never in your entire life had a feeling of, happiness, joy, any of those feelings. None of those, because you had no feelings. There was no laws and also no capacity in the soul, imagine, to experience those things. Imagine what your life would be like. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? Because you wouldn't even feel. So there would be no senses. Your body would have been created with no senses, even. But if you look at an animal, its body has senses, but there's no mechanism to feed into a soul that then has an awareness about those senses. Right? So God created you with the ability to have senses, so you could, as a part of this physical, and also in part of your spiritual and also your soul, there's this whole thing of senses that go on. The sense of sight, sense of hearing, touch, taste. These kind of senses give you an experience. And the beauty of the experience is it teaches you things. That's one of the ways in which you have an experience. So your senses become important. And then there's also the aspect of what happens to you in your future, your idea or concept of self, your concept of others, your concept of the world, your understanding of whether there is a God or not, and all those things. You could call those your spiritual life, you could call that. He also created that for you. So in the process of doing all of these things, God gave you so many gifts. But if you think about your process of discovering them, can you see it's going to have to be gradual? It's like, you're born a baby. There's physical senses. Am I a man? Even though we're in an adult skin, an adult flesh suit, as some people call it, you still got physical senses. You would feel your weight on the ground. You can feel the touch of others and so forth. Now, it doesn't matter whether you were born a baby or as a man and a mon were, like incarnating as an adult, they are brand new to those senses. So they're just in the process of experiencing these senses. So you could say, when we described all these things when I was teaching in the first century, I tried to put all these things together and I called it a name, which was, it's a process of becoming self-aware, you could say, isn't it? A process of becoming, of beginning the process of learning about oneself, right? So we called it, it's the incarnation process, which is the soul, unaware, coming to a form which allows it to go through these experiences in order to become aware. And so I called it the process of individualization. Right? So the process of individualization is this process where you begin unaware, and the moment you are incarnated, whether it was God doing it for the first human couple, or when you are conceiving a child, from that moment on, individualization has occurred. The actual act of individualization has occurred. And the reason why God had that happening on earth was so that you could have the gift of having a child. So it adds to your experience as a soul to understand and know what it's like to have a child. So you can understand and know what it's like to love someone without it being romantic love. Right? But actually a love based on principle and desire for the welfare of the individual. Right? If God didn't allow you to have that process, it was going to be more difficult for you to learn these things. So that's why God allowed these things to occur. But in the process of allowing that, it also gives you as the parent the opportunity to damage the child. Doesn't it? Because you've got free will. So you could choose to love the child, or you can choose to damage the child, and you've got the option to do either. Right? And unfortunately, most humans do damage their children, and oftentimes they're completely unaware of how, because we have very little sense of self-awareness that we've purposefully developed. Most of us just go through life having this experience, having that experience, and having that experience, not understanding that we're learning. We're just having this experience and having this experience and having this experience, thinking it's just all experiences really, but we're not understanding that we're actually learning to engage spiritual, emotional, sexual and physical senses. And we're learning how to use them. Right? Now, God created the ability for you to do that, but in the process of giving you free will, you could do that in harmony with the Creator's law or out of harmony with the Creator's law. And that's where our problems begin. Now, God can't then go, if he wants to be economical, can't go, he's not going to rub out what you choose to do for the sake of the next generation. Because to do that, he'd be rubbing it out on every generation. He would have to do it on every generation. He wants humans to learn we need to take responsibility. This is a part of our spiritual senses that we need to develop, that we need to take responsibility ourselves for our own creations. And if we have done damage, we need to undo that damage. If we have taken the action to destroy something, we need to take the action to fix it. If we have done damage to our own soul, we need to fix what damage we chose to do. God's not going to fix that for us. There's not going to be any Messiah come along who fixes it for you. This is what a lot of people want. This is how the Christian faith got established, because everyone was told, we're all sinners, don't worry, you can continue sinning, and there's going to be one person comes along and his blood's going to pay for it all. Like, the harm to him will pay for all of your sin. That was the concept. And a lot of us like that concept because it means that I don't have to be responsible for paying for my own sin. It's not true. We are all personally responsible for our own sin. And you can see why, because God wants you to learn that this is one of the things that he wants us to learn, and that is, if I sin, there are consequences, and I can fix them. And I've been created a powerful enough being to fix them. I've been created a powerful enough being to reverse the effects of my sin. You see, a lot of human religions that have been created, all of which are for mostly false, right? And a lot of those religions have been created with the idea that you're a sinner and you forever will be. In other words, it's disempowering you right from the beginning of your life to think that whatever you start out with, you're going to end up with, or worse, right? And that's not true. None of that's true. The truth is, God's created you with this gift of free will which says, I can undo the bad decisions I make, but I have to choose to do it myself. You follow? It has to be me making that decision, not for myself, not for you. You need to make the decision for you. I need to make the decision for me to undo the effects of my sin. Okay? So we come across to here. Yeah. And then work our way back.
Yeah. Is God supporting us in this process with some additional forces?
Of course. Like, God doesn't just say, you're on your own now. You know, like, if you were a parent looking after a child and the child, you know, become wayward, you know, become doing some things wrong, would you stand back and just go, you've made your own mistakes, so be it, you know, and not want to help them? If you loved them, you'd want to help them, would you, to overcome that? So yes, God has put into place many things. Of course, the law, the big expression of his personality is one of those things that he's put in place to correct you. But he's also put in place mechanisms via which you can get help from others. There are people in the spirit world who are now developed because they've been there for 150,000 years or less, you know, depending on how long they've been there. And they can share with you their experience and they can help you overcome the same things I've had to overcome. God's also put in place natural things that might also cause you to come into contact with experience of love on earth. And as Mary pointed out to me in the break also, God's also on earth in particular given you this sort of very gentle, compassionate way of making adjustments, rather than by the time you hit the spirit world, it's a bit more forceful. You know, so if a person doesn't make the adjustments on earth where everything is quite, I would call it almost relaxed in terms of how God's enforcing the law on earth, the law is still being enforced, but there's a lot of compassion in the way it's being enforced, and you only have to make small adjustments before you get quite big rewards. So in the spirit world, if you haven't made those changes on earth, now, you know, obviously you need extra force. You know, there's extra law force placed upon you as limitations in the spirit world. But even then, not without help. There's other people who have been through the same experience. There's also an inbuilt mechanism of the soul, actually, that God created, this soul. And we talked about this last week at Belgium, with the mechanism of the conscience, which is a mechanism that God created where the two halves of the soul could utilise the mechanism. I've drawn it as two mechanisms, but it's actually one. It belongs to the whole soul, you know, this mechanism. And it allows the Creator to share truths with you directly if you so desire. The problem is that there's a terrible lack of education on earth about these things. Does that make sense? On earth, there's no education provided about how to use the soul-based mechanisms. Now, that, again, is a direct result of choices on earth. The truth about it has been available for thousands of years, and yet the average person knows nothing about them. Right? So that is indicative of the fact that many of us don't have a desire to actually know. Given the fact that the truth is available, it means many didn't have a desire to know. What brought you here? It was your desire to know. Does that make sense? You had enough open-heartedness and enough open-mindedness to make a decision and go, maybe this guy who says he's Jesus and everybody thinks he's crazy is not so crazy after all, and maybe he's got some truths, and maybe I should go along and listen and just see whether they're true or not. Right? Now, we all have that potential experience with every truth that's out in the universe. You know, a lot of them may seem quite out there, but we've got to allow ourselves to be open-hearted and open-minded enough to discover new things. So obviously you guys are, otherwise you wouldn't be here, but many aren't, because many just live their life automaton, or on automatic. But God's created these beautiful parts of you, even your conscience, but also helpers from outside to help you to learn how to use these things, how to use everything that you've been given as a gift. He's done that. So the way I've approached my life is that it's all like an experiment, yeah? But it's also a joyful experiment. Many of us approach it like it's a really hard experiment, but it actually can be a joyful experiment, and no matter what pain you experience, actually.
Before you move on, can I answer that?
Mary wants to say.
Like with Dayan's question, I really understand that, like, when you're confronted with pain that you feel is in you as a result of other people's free will choices, that often there's this triggered feeling of like, this is unjust, I didn't do anything and here it is in me. But my understanding from God is that, you know, God wants us to understand that the gift of our free will is very, very powerful, you know, and so even part of you recognizing there's pain in me that came from someone else's use of their free will is, or if you kind of, the problem is a lot of us get very unhumble about our pain, and so then we get stuck on it. We get stuck on that thing of like, oh, here I am at this pain and I don't want to feel it, and so it's somebody else's fault, and this is how this injustice feeling perpetuates itself. But if we're able to experience our pain, we understand, wow, that's very powerful, the free will gift that I have. Look at the impact that everyone has. Look at the impact it's had on me. I also have that gift. How
and
am
I also have
using
impact on others.
I'm impacting others, and also as we go through that process, we learn, yeah, this is a pretty powerful gift I have, free will, because I can use my free will not only to release my pain, which seemed insurmountable before, and look, I did it. So wow, this is a pretty powerful thing, but also I understand, what can I create with this free will? It must be pretty powerful. And every spirit who's even in the 6th sphere, the 7th sphere, even the 5th sphere, understands what I do with this will has a lot of impact on myself and the people around me. And God really wants us to learn that lesson. So even in the misuse of free will, which creates pain and suffering, if we're sensitive, if you think about it as a parent, if you're sensitive, you're going to recognize that and go, oh, wow, my free will is harming another person. But even if you're not, and you are the child who's having to face the pain that's, you know, come to you through generations, if you can be humble to that pain, you understand, wow, I'm pretty powerful. Like, that didn't even stop me, that pain. You know, I got rid of that, and I can create good things with this will. So God wants you to know how powerful you are. It's very powerful. Yeah.
Microphone back there. Yep.
Just here.
Yep.
And I'm guessing you see it from the other side. When you experience it on yourself, you're seeing it from the other side, so it's much faster to learn.
Yeah, it's like you can really say there's a number of different ways of learning, isn't it? You can observe other people making mistakes, and you can go, I need to not make the same mistakes because I can see that mistake. You know, you observe a man beating up a woman and you see the damage it has to the woman, you go, I'm not going to beat up a woman ever. Right? So if you see your own father beating up your mother, you would go, I'm never going to do that to a woman ever, wouldn't you? Because you'd see the damage to your mother. So that's an external experience that you didn't have to see and learn something. Or you're going to have to do it yourself. So you're going to have to go through the personal experience yourself if you don't learn from your environment. And most of us are choosing to have our personal experiences, even though it's quite obvious that the same personal experience with thousands of others, millions of others, is not working for them. So many of us sort of feel like, I'll try the same thing, but it should be a different result for me because I'm me. And I'm nicer than they are, or I'm better than they are, or whatever. I'm more intelligent than they are, or I'm cleverer than they are. And so that, even though I'm doing the same thing as they're doing, it won't affect me, is the general feeling many of us have. Only to find in our future that it does. And so many of us are not capable, unfortunately, of learning from other people's experiences. We've got to learn from our own. But also learning from your own experience is a very powerful tool for your future. Because as you learn from your own experience, you are most probably going to learn, and then once you have some awareness of what you've learnt, it's highly unlikely you'll do the same damaging things again.
You can see that this is why humility is such an important quality for us to develop, because you can see that if you begin to release the pain of your own childhood early in your life, there's many decisions you won't make because you'll understand the gravity of it. But most of us don't do that, and then we start making our own mistakes, and then we have further opportunities. And this is the grace that I was talking to Jesus about in the break. There's a lot of grace here on earth. The laws are operating, but there's a lot of opportunities for us to correct course continually, Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just up the back there, and then we come down to Olga here. So Olga,
if you just leave your hand up.
Leave your hand up there, else. So up the back there, thank you.
Hello. I'm just a little bit confused. I think I saw on one of your early videos that you said that it's actually the parents or the adults that attract the soul.
Yes.
But it's sort of going to the point of being born into a crappy world and also free will. If the soul itself doesn't have any choice where it's born into, on this world we get a lot of different situations. There's children trying to earn a living on Indian
rubbish tips.
Rubbish tips.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And then where was I going with that? And also, sorry, when you pass and you're sort of floating around in the spirit world somewhere, like yourself,
which you're not doing,
Mary, and other people who've come back to Earth,
When you say come back to Earth, you mean...
Well, you've come back to Earth, you say you're Jesus and Mary.
Yeah, but not reincarnated.
Is it the same soul that you have as Jesus?
Yep.
Yeah. So, in that respect, your soul chose to come back here, or was it simply your parents that brought you back here?
No.
Who's doing the choosing, or is it a combination?
Good question.
Of both?
Yeah, the same question was asked in Belgium actually. In your first incarnation, the incarnation of the soul is an instinctual process. So God created amongst all of God's creatures, so you think of birds, animals, and also obviously this human form is an animal form, isn't it? The physical body part of it is an animal form. So if we look at the half of the soul, my half is the male half, and then I've got a male spirit body, which looks like a man, and a male physical body, that has all the appendages of the male. So this male half of the soul, when it incarnates, it's an instinctual process. It has to incarnate in order to be individualized. So how it incarnates is governed by many what are called laws of attraction. Those laws of attraction, because this soul, so back in the first century when I first incarnated, my soul didn't determine who was my mum and who was my dad. What determined who was my mum and dad was the environment that I was born into, conceived into, my mum and dad's emotional states that needed to be corrected, along with some of my mum and dad's states that didn't need correction but were a part of their nature and their personality. And where my soul goes is the best for my soul as well as for their souls in terms of development, but it's not determined by me, it's determined by law. All right? Now, what happens after then is determined by choice, and particularly the choices of my parents. So for me, in the first century, my father chose to be quite abusive with me. I was quite frequently yelled at, screamed at, belted, as a child in the first century. And also, when I was very, very young, I was sent to a military school in Egypt. And for nearly 2 years, I was tortured there, right, at my father's agreement. Right? When I say tortured there, they had physical ways of forcing children to learn military aspects of life, swords, spears, shields, using all of these things that my father believed. He thought I was the Messiah, and so he believed that I would be the leader of Israel. He thought I'd be the king of Israel, and he thought that I would need the skills to be able to boss men around, and I would need the skills to be able to control people, and I'd need to learn violence. And so he purposefully sent me to a school to learn violence. Yeah, and a part of that school, violence included things like raping women and all sorts of things. Now, I didn't do those things, but I got badly tortured for not doing them because they thought that I wasn't malleable enough, right? And so that was my father. That was my father in the first century. He had a very strong feeling I was a Messiah, and he wanted to make me into it, was his feeling. Now, many of your parents have a similar feeling towards you, right? Now, when I observed all of that, I didn't blame God for that. In my first century incarnation, I didn't blame God for that. I blamed my dad for that. Right? He made those choices and decisions. But the problem many of us are doing in this argument we have with God, we would prefer to blame God for what we believe is create an imperfect system, when actually it's a perfect system being destroyed by the free will of humans. Right? In other words, the free will of humans being exercised unlovingly is going to eventually affect any system because of the power of the human. It's going to affect any system that occurs, even if it was created perfect. It's going to affect it. Our unloving actions are going to affect that system. God wanted us to learn that. He wanted us to learn that if we choose to be unloving individuals, it is going to affect a perfect system and destroy it. But he also created that this earth wasn't our only experience, which is very important to our future, because if we have a terrible existence on earth because of the choices of others, and in the first century my whole life was ended because of the choices of others. I wanted to live with Mary until I was, a few hundred years old at least on earth. As it turned out, I married Mary, and 18 months later I was murdered. Right? That was because of the choices of others. But as soon as I arrived in the spirit world, my development of love meant that I could go to places that no human had ever been before. Right? So God also created a compensatory system for the fact that humans would choose to do unloving things. And that compensatory system lasts for tens of thousands of years, not just 70 or 80. But again, on earth, we don't have perspective. And part of having perspective is time perspective of time. On earth, we think this is the only life, this is my only experience. Having 80 years of bad experience, or in my case in the first century, a lot of my first century experience, I was tortured when I was between 5 and 7. I was tortured again in my teenage years by a group of teenagers and adults. And then when I was 19, I was almost killed through torture again. And then I was also tortured to death. In between that time, there were 4 attempts on my life as well. Right? So this all happened to me in the first century. None of it's written about, but it all happened to me. Now, in the process of that happening to me, I could have said, right, I'm going to be just as evil as everyone around me. This is all unfair. All this violence is terrible. I'm going to learn to be violent and be violent to others. Or, as I did do, I saw, actually, I don't like this violence. This violence feels terrible towards myself, towards my person. It actually helped me feel like I would never commit that level of violence towards another by having these experiences. Now, I'm not saying that God wanted me to have those experiences, because God didn't. God created a perfect human world where I'm on a man incarnated, and he also, and by this stage, by the way, I'd managed to have a chat with him about it, right, because of my spiritual development at the time. And so I knew that there was this pristine earth, and men, Humans had destroyed it. Humans had destroyed the system God had made through the exercise of their will. Now, it was very important for me to also learn that through the exercise of my will in a loving direction, I could do the opposite. I could change the world. Right? And to this day, my name is known, even though most people on earth don't recognise it as me. But to this day, my name is known as somebody who did that 2,000 years later. Right? And that's because I made the choice to actually be a loving individual because I could feel God's intention was not the world we were in, but rather a different world. Right? And I needed to live in harmony with that. So a lot of the experiences that we start to reason about when it comes to our feelings about God, and really what many of you are expressing is your anger with God now. And you don't realise it, but these are areas that you're angry with God about. So you hear the truth being we incarnate, there's no choice of the soul incarnating, it's all governed by law, and you hear all that truth, and then you go, what about the person in India, and what about all these people? But God's put in place corrections, all of those things over time. But most of us don't have any perspective at all. So an example of perspective is some of the friends that I have now in the spirit world were actually on the Sanhedrin, and they chose to kill me in the 1st century. But I knew in time they would eventually listen to the truth. That's perspective. Right? The perspective that things change, that people change. The perspective that given enough time, many people will actually make choice to be more loving. That's having perspective. Yeah. Now, I want to finish this answer because in the process of making that decision to have perspective and to also allow to make some individual choices of my own, it doesn't really matter in a way. And when I say it doesn't matter, of course God cares, and also I care, but at the end of the day, the individualization process has occurred the instant this soul is conceived, incarnates onto the earth. The instant that it happens, this soul is now individualized. Once the soul is individualized, it can even pass in the womb without having experience, which, by the way, is the worst thing that could happen to the soul because it has no experience in its gestation period, right? It's better if it does have one. But even the very worst thing that could happen, which is that, not having any experience at all here, it will still be able to grow, still be able to learn about itself, still be able to learn the universe. It'll all happen in the spirit world, of course, rather than on earth, but it will still happen. Right? So the process of individualization, which was question asked, occurs the way it does now to give you the opportunity and gift of being a parent. That's the reason why God chose to incarnate you here rather than him actually dish you out a spirit body in the spirit world. Do you understand? So each of you could end up with the experience of being a mother and a father, which, if any of you have done it, know that it's quite an interesting experience, isn't it? Don't you find that? Who of you have had children? Yeah? Haven't you found it to be a very interesting experience? Haven't you learnt a lot from it? Right? So God's given you that gift so that you could do that. Now, in the process of giving you gifts, he's also giving you a knife, really, as an example. Every gift that is given to you also has the power to cause some damage. Every gift. You think about it. Any gift I give you will have the power to cause you damage. I give you a car. You could drive it off a cliff. You could drive it into somebody else. It's going to cause damage. You could run somebody over with it. It can cause you damage. If I give you a knife, you can cut up some fruit with it, or you can stab yourself with it, or stab someone else with it. Every gift that is possible to create. I give you a house, right? It could fall down on you because I didn't design it well. But if I really designed it well and give you a house, right, there's a good chance that you'll live in it the rest of your life potentially, right? But you could choose to misuse it, couldn't you? You could, there's a support structure there and you could choose to cut through it with a chainsaw. Wouldn't be very good, but you can choose to do it. And this is the thing. We all need to come to terms with the power of our will. Right? And God's given you this experience in order for you to do that. Now, if that child goes into, like India, like Mary and I were watching a show just briefly a few days ago about people, it was people from England who went to Ghana to see what it's like to work in a gold mine. Right? Because, a lot of people in the West have, gold, everything on, right? I don't wear any jewellery myself, but a lot of people like it. And, so they want gold, right? So they want to get bling. I'm not sure why. I hate the feeling of anything on my body myself, but they want bling. But they don't understand the effect of the use of their will, which is, in Ghana, little children by the stage of 5 starting to work in gold mines, right? And whole families are working in gold mines all of their life, every day, going through lots and lots of pain. We talked about this in Belgium with regard to chocolate, right? Those of us in the West in particular, like a bit of chocolate now and then. But when you look at the choices we're making and the effects it's having on people who are actually harvesting and growing that chocolate, it's actually very, very damaging to their life, One chocolate bar, whole day's labour, and the average person there gets one, the equivalent of about $1 Australian dollar, which is about half a US dollar, to a dollar US, for a whole day's labour. And of course they don't have, houses like we have, and they don't have cars, and they don't have any of these things because, they walk around bare feet and they've only got one set of clothes, and, tomorrow I'll wear a different T-shirt, but they won't. And it's all because of the choices we make, right? In terms of we want it at a certain price and the companies want to make profits and they want shareholders and all these other things, but no one's considering the poor person actually growing the stuff and the effect on the environment and all those things, right? So this is the thing we need to come to realise. It's the use of our will that is the problem here. It's not what God created. It's the use of our will, what we just chose to do with what God created, that is the problem. And we need to learn to fix our own problems. But the majority of us completely ignore our problems, and not only that, go so far as to blame God for them, which, if you think about it, isn't very fair, given the fact that God gave us the best possible start. Not only that, wants us to correct it. Not only that, made a whole heap of laws to correct it. Not only that, provided a spirit world to compensate for everything we do here. Like, he's done so many things, but he's asking you to do something, which is live in harmony with the Creator's law. Make sense? So, back there.
A question to you. What happened to you is how did you, or was there a point where you decided to choose love and not the violence? Yeah.
Well, the biggest thing in the first century that made me choose love rather than violence was the fact that I allowed myself to feel what it was like to be on the receiving end of violence. To really feel it. Like, to grieve it, to really feel what it was like to be attacked and, belittled and then, of course, even more extreme, like put into places where you physically were harmed and so forth. I allowed myself to feel it. In the process of feeling it, the biggest feeling that developed in me was I don't ever want to do that to anybody else.
Can you qualify that actually by saying you felt it, but you attributed the effect to the correct cause?
Yeah, I didn't blame myself for it.
You didn't blame yourself, you didn't blame society, you said this is...
Well, I blamed... what I blamed was the sin in society. What I could start to see was if my father wanted to, belt me and everything, and then he wanted to put me into a military college, if you want to call it that. It was actually run by some ex-Roman soldiers who were quite violent and also quite dark and like malevolent. If he wanted to do all of that, and I, was forced to go there. There was no choice. I was only 5 anyway, and it was forced to go there. So if he wanted to do all of that, I could see, that meant that he had some problems. I didn't think I had problems coping. I thought, because I didn't cope. Like when I say I didn't cope, I cried almost every day there for 2 years. Right? I handled it in the sense of dealt with it, but I didn't come out toughened up. In fact, if anything, because I allowed myself to feel, I come out more soft and go, I'm never going to do that to anybody again myself. I'm never going to do that myself. And I'm never going to agree with anybody doing it to anybody else either. Yeah.
You didn't call it human nature.
I didn't call it human nature. It was human malevolence. Evil. It was evil, what was done. Yeah? So you've got to name a thing for what it is. That's
the problem on earth is that we very often misconstrue, like we blame ourselves, or we say, oh, well, that's how it is, or we don't, even if we feel, sometimes we don't really grieve what it's actually about.
Yeah. Straight behind.
The truth.
When you were there and you knew the next day probably some bad thing was going to happen
every day,
how did you have the faith to not go into a desperation and to keep going, that it's going to stop someday? Or
by this stage, it caused me to start to feel about God, like whether God existed and what God's nature would be, and and every time I felt about God, I felt this sort of very loving presence, and also love for me. And the love that I felt for me, even though I was very young, but the love I felt for me, I basically spent a lot of my life, in that period of my life, sort of just feeling about spiritual things. And in a way, I was zoning out of what happened physically, in terms of detuning to a degree from my physical body, but I was also learning how to control my physical senses. It's one reason why I didn't experience any pain when I was crucified, because by that stage I'd learnt to experience pain without feeling it. Right? I'd learnt to control the physiological responses of my body, including my nervous system, by that stage. So it helped me in my future to develop these qualities that I had later. But I didn't know that at the time. It was just something that I decided to do. It's hard to. I could see that the people around me were deciding the opposite. So all of the boys, there were about 120 boys who had all been sent by their fathers, and they weren't mostly Jews. They were different religions, and most of them were Egyptians, actually, fathers who sent their sons to the same school, because we were living in Alexandria, which is in Egypt at the time. But as a result, many of them, I could see, were choosing to do the very thing the soldiers were getting them to do, right? Out of agreement and acceptance and a lot of other things. And I could see how, the choice to do the wrong thing began sort of in small ways and led to bigger ways. When we first started the school, there was all just this sort of words that were all used to try and toughen up the kids. But then those words turned into actions, and then those actions turned into abuse, and then the abuse oftentimes turned into torture. It was a gradual process which the Roman army used to desensitise all of their soldiers for warfare. And that process was being engaged by the leaders of this school, if you wanted to call it that. It's sort of like more like a compound. But and I could see, even at a young age, that it was destroying everybody. And I could let it destroy me or not. Now, at this stage, unbeknown to me, I had some relationship to God, but I didn't understand it. I wasn't aware of it, but it helped me develop more of a relationship with God that I became aware of, because I wanted somebody to help me, to get out of it. And I couldn't see any person on earth doing it. My own dad wasn't going to do it. My mother wasn't going to do it because she was too afraid of my dad. Eventually, what happened was the school, you could say the principals, but really what they were violent Roman soldiers, met with my father and said I was untrainable. And they said to him that if I stayed there, I would die. And they asked him whether they wanted that for me. Right? Because I was so resistive to everything by that stage. When I say resistive, I refused to do pretty much everything. Right? And every time there was violence because I refused. Right? And in the end, they said, because of the strength of my will, they said they'd have to kill me to get, and I still wouldn't do what they want. They recognised that, but it took them 2 years to recognise they'd have to kill me, and they still wouldn't get me to do what they wanted. And so they met with my father and told him that they're going to have to kill me to get, and even then I was still not going to do what they wanted. What was my dad going to do about that? And my dad decided to take me out. That's what happened. But only because they learned that my will was unbreakable. And in that time, by this stage I was 7, I knew my will was unbreakable. Right? Now, I had some advantages in the first century, and one of the advantages was I didn't inherit the sins of my father and my mother. Now, in this life, it's been a very different experience. Like, it's taken me to this age to realise my will is unbreakable. Right? But in the first century, by the time I was 7, I knew it was unbreakable. The beauty of knowing that and the power that gives you as an individual, immense. I knew I could handle anything. I could handle it emotionally. I could handle anything happening to my body. I could handle anything happening emotionally to me, and I was unbreakable. Yep. It's a great thing to know about yourself. Yeah? Franz? Where is the mic that was here? Olga was next anyway. So.
I just wanted to ask, because you knew the people were doing painful things to you.
That it was wrong.
Yeah, that was wrong.
Yeah.
But how was it possible for you to not judge them? Because I think it's a different thing that you know someone does something wrong.
Well, in the process of them doing it, they demonstrated to me that that had been done to them. You see, these men running this school were Roman soldiers, and they were retired, but they were Roman soldiers, and all of them, they, in the process of their yelling and screaming at you, they tell you things about themselves, right? And one of the things they tell about themselves was their own experience of the same indoctrination, the same abuse. And, one day you might get the chance of talking to Cornelius, one of our friends, and he will tell you he was taken from his parents at the age of 3 and put into one of these schools, right? And he became a Roman soldier. He became a centurion in the end. But it was through years and years of malevolent abuse. You follow? And so I could, they told me that. They told me as if it was good. Now they're telling me their experience of this happened to me and this, I'm doing this to you because this is how I learnt, that kind of thing. And in the process, they told me a lot about themselves, and that is that I should have compassion for them. Because they are these damaged adults who had murdered, hundreds of people, but who had grown from these children that were taken from their parents out of a loving environment into this terribly malicious, hateful environment, and that's all they knew. And they had no capacity to reverse it. Like, when I say no capacity, these people had no self-reflection. They just thought, what happened to me? I'm going to visit on the next generation. Many of you have done the same with your own children. What happened to me? I'm either going to choose to not or choose to visit on my children. And these guys said this was good, hardening you up, getting you ready for the reality of war, right? The reality of fighting for a country. Yeah. And very violent, of course. But the reality was that they had also experienced the same as what they were doing to me. And even a bit worse, really, because most of them were taken as children. Like, when I say not 5-year-old, I mean 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds. Taken from their families and put into service. By the time they became teenagers, all of them were in military service. When I say teenagers, as soon as they had the height of an adult, so for most people that's like between 13 and 15, they were now in the army. But they had had 10 years. The reason why the Romans were such a huge military force was because they did this. They desensitised generations of children to enter the army, to fight for Rome. And they gifted them with citizenship as a reward, if you survived.
Jay, can you also say, I sort of feel from a scientific perspective, judgment is a mechanism we use to prevent emotion?
Our own.
Our own emotion, yeah. So
it's a way of externalising your own experience, judgment. It's a way of saying, they're like, not just that they're at fault, because I could see these men were at fault, right? But also that they're substantially worthless is really what judgment is saying. When you judge another, you're saying they're worth less than you. And I couldn't say that about these guys. No matter what evil they were perpetrating, I could feel that they were just kids, really, in these violent adult constructs that they had learnt through their entire life, and they didn't even have the adult development to see they were doing the wrong thing. Yeah. So it's hard to judge someone like that. So, Franz?
Yeah, I mean, if you stayed there for 2 years with so much humility, it must have been quite a powerful effect as well for the educators. I mean, it must have been really kind of hard.
It had a powerful effect on them in the sense they couldn't, coming to terms with the fact that they had to kill me and they still couldn't get me to do what I wanted. See, normally with any child that they'd come into contact with up until that point, and by the way, both of them men are now celestial spirits.
Of course.
Right? So, but because of all of this that happened, right? But they realised at this point that my will was unbreakable, and as a result of it being unbreakable, they would have to kill me. And then, of course, they were getting paid by my father to educate me. And, of course, if they killed me, Dad's not going to be too impressed, right? So that's why they eventually had a discussion with my father about it. Yeah? You understand?
But, yeah.
I don't want to labour this. It's just an experience I had. But I'm trying to share with you the principle that I'm not to blame for how you use your will, but I am responsible for how I use mine. Yeah.
But at the same time, it reminds the others of how wrong they are doing if there is like one kind of right person, and it's actually quite painful within them.
Yes.
Even if they distance.
It's
from
partially
their
why they got so
consciousness.
violent, is because it was a reminder they were doing the wrong thing towards Will. But also, it was also the reason why I was eventually removed from the situation. Yeah, so eventually, upholding love, I was automatically removed from the situation, even though the result could have been different, right? And that's happened to me all my life in the first century, and through this one actually, where I've been removed from situations. Once I've learnt the lesson of love, situations automatically stop and things change. Yep. Yeah. So back to Alex, and then back to
Maya.
Alex.
So it's actually a powerful example of how what will can do with those guys being now in the celestial realm.
That's right.
Yeah.
Again, perspective of time. Yeah. This is something that I learnt a lot in the first century, was having the perspective of time, and sometimes not even in the first century, but afterwards. Like, you know, my father and mother. My father, he was on the Sanhedrin, but he wasn't a part of the Sanhedrin. He wasn't there the evening of my accusal and the decision to, you know, give me to the Romans to kill me. But he was on the Sanhedrin. He fundamentally agreed with the religious construct of the day that I was actually in complete disagreement with. And so, you know, my father didn't change until after I died. Some of my brothers didn't change till after I died. Most of my family rejected me before my death, and it was only really my mother who accepted me before my death in the first century. And even then, she often used to go around saying to people, I'm nuts. She did. She, you know, on 2 occasions, she prevented me from getting murdered by just telling everyone that I was crazy. And because she told them that I was crazy, and she was my mother, they listened to her and prevented my death. They didn't kill me, but they only didn't kill me because they thought I was crazy. So I was teaching all of these fundamental things about the human soul, God, relationship with God, and also quite confrontational about the world, the religion I was in at the time, or the religion everybody else was in at the time. And so naturally everyone's pretty upset with me. And if they could believe I was crazy, then they could sort of explain it away without having to kill me for it. So on 2 occasions that happened. One time I nearly got thrown off a cliff. And my mother said, oh, he's just crazy. What are you doing? She stood in front of them. You know, she was on the edge of the cliff, standing in front of them, yelling at them, saying, she's crazy, can't you see he's crazy? You know, like, and eventually the whole body of people calmed down and said, oh, the poor fella is crazy. Like, he thinks he's a messiah, he's just nuts, right? And so they let me go. Yeah. But I didn't really like being called crazy all the time, right? But also I could see my mum, she was afraid. She was afraid of me dying. She didn't understand there was a life afterwards. I did. I wasn't concerned about it, you see. And this is one reason why she thought I was crazy, because I wasn't concerned about my death. And she was far more concerned about my death than I was. As I suppose many of you mothers are about your children. Oftentimes you're far more concerned about their death than they are, because many of them are connected to the fact that they have a spirit body and can leave, you know, at any time. So, you know, oftentimes we're, as parents, more afraid than our children are. Alex?
Can I ask you an additional question?
Yeah.
Which indicates you weren't afraid of feeling.
That's right. I wasn't afraid of feeling.
Was this a quality God gave to you, or you developed?
You could say it was a quality I was free to develop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because of not getting the inheritance of your parents.
The inherited sin from my parents, yeah. Many of you don't realise that, but the major inherited sin from your parents is the feeling that you can't cope with your feelings.
Can you say that again?
One of the major inherited sins from your parents is the feeling that you can't handle your feelings. You can't cope with them. That's a huge sin that gets handed down from generation to generation, and I didn't have it.
Where does braveness come into this?
Sorry, where does...
Braveness?
courage and bravery are qualities I feel that happen. The more of a relationship with God I had, the less worried I was about my person. I came to have, and once I became a one with God, obviously that was the truth, but even before then, I came to have the feeling that God loves me, God cares about me, I know I have a spirit body, I know I have a spirit life. People can kill my body, but it's not going to stop my life. Right? So, can you see, like, to me, truth enables bravery.
And it's also information you had.
Yeah. You see, the main reason why we're afraid is because we don't know the truth, right? And so the main reason why the average person on earth is afraid of dying, for example, is because they don't know the truth of what's afterwards. Because if you knew the truth and you actually felt the truth of what's afterwards, you wouldn't be so afraid of it, right? You wouldn't purposefully do it because you knew that would be an act of will against your body. But if it happens, you're not going to go, oh, isn't it terrible? Most of you don't realise that for many people who pass, there's not even any pain in the process. Often the worst experiences on earth is the pain you have leading to your death.
Resisting death.
You know, like cancers and other diseases like that eat your body away, which are actually a lot about what's happening emotionally to yourself. These forms of death are far more painful than actually dying.
Wouldn't you say that resistance is the actual pain you have? I mean, not the actual pain, but it's more painful.
But all resistance is caused by fear, and all fears are based on untruths. So fundamentally, it's because we don't know or feel the truth that these things happen. Yeah. So it's very important to understand this in your progress, right? Because if you can understand that you as a soul, you've been given this beautiful world to actually experience and learn about yourself and learn about life, and in particular learn about your will, learn about how to use your will. And you start developing what I call spiritual qualities. So spiritual qualities, things like faith, humility, truth, love, compassion, understanding, kindness. You know, you could say the fundamental spiritual qualities are humility, truth, love and faith, right? And responsibility. They're sort of like the fundamental qualities. And then linked with every one of those qualities, they all have intricate parts to them. Like, you know, an example of that is truth. Let's look at truth. Well, there's sub-qualities of truth, which are transparency, openness, freedom of expression, freedom of delivery, you know, honesty in delivery. So not just thinking true, but being true, acting true.
Expressing yourself truly. Not just speaking words, but being.
Being yourself truly. These are all aspects of truth. And so the more and more developed you become, the more you realise that every one of these fundamental qualities has all of these beautiful sub-qualities, I would call them, but it's hard to describe them really, that are all very much fundamentally a part of your future existence, if you make them be. You know, but that's going to require your will to do. It requires your becoming more self-aware, becoming more humble, becoming more desirous, using passion to drive your life in a direction that's loving. Right? And then when you do that, you learn a lot of things. And you then can express yourself with what you've learnt and then affect others positively through what you learn as well. Yeah? So yes, it's a very important thing to realise that even what you call your fears is just an unacceptance of a truth. It's not accepting a truth in your heart. And many of us have been educated to do that as children. And of course, as adults, we now need to uneducate ourselves in that direction. But unfortunately, if you think about the possibilities for humanity, if you were educated on the fundamental parts of your nature, And then you were also educated about the thing called the conscience, which I just listed. And then you were educated about humility, love, truth, and faith as major qualities, as well as self-responsibility. Ibo. You were educated about those things. And this started happening the day you went to school. 5. You were 5 years of age. Do you think by the time you're 15, you'd have a pretty good understanding of the world, wouldn't you? And also a pretty good understanding of what makes you happy, what brings you joy, right? If these things were educated to you right from the beginning. But see, humans put so much emphasis, and this is something we need to discuss maybe after lunch, right? We put so much emphasis on developing the mind of the child, you know, in mathematics, in language, in sciences and so forth, which are all very interesting. But fundamentally, those things won't bring us a lot of joy compared to these things if we understood them. We spend so much time educating the mind before we educate about these things. So unfortunately, we get to the stage where we don't really, we're like 30 and we don't really understand any of these things really. And we're like 50 and we don't understand. And unfortunately for many of us, if we're not careful, we'll be 100 and dead in the spirit world and still not understand them. Right? And that's because we could take different opportunities as people on earth and educate children from a young age about these things. But of course it's going to require a big change, isn't it? Right, en masse, big change to do that. But imagine how great it would be. A world where every child understood their physical self, sexual self, emotional self, their senses and the use of their senses and spiritual development. They understood the quality of humility, love, truth, faith and self-responsibility, and they knew how to act in harmony with them. Do you think by the time you're 7 years of age there'd be bullying in schools? It'd be very hard, wouldn't it? And now none of these things are educated, so by the time we're in our 60s and 70s, I'm 61 now, and, by the time we're my age now, we're still pretty clueless. And we still are not happy, oftentimes, not content with our life, quite disappointed with it, don't know how these things function really. We start having degradation of our body, and we've already lived a lot of our life, and yet we haven't enjoyed a lot of it. Yeah. Which is the result, fundamentally, of not respecting truth that comes from the Creator. It's fundamentally because I don't believe God's real, really real. I don't believe God exists, or if I do, I feel that God has nothing to do with me. Right? And that's a fundamental error we're making in our decision-making processes. Right? Because if God does exist, and this is something that I thought about a lot in my first incarnation. If God exists and is real, then surely the best possible life you could ever live is about receiving information from the Creator of me. Right? If I can receive information from my Creator, it's going to be way beyond anything I receive from my mum and dad. Way beyond their level of expertise or knowledge on any subject, way beyond their ability to even understand if I keep progressing. And that's what it turned out for me to be in the first century and now. I know now far more my mum and dad now. None of you probably have ever seen a picture of my mum and dad or anything, but my mum and dad now are, my dad's 80. Just let me work it out. He's 82 and my mother's 77, and they're not happy. They're not content. They're not happy with life. They have every modern convenience, probably that all of you have, and still not content. They are scared witless of their death. They're terrified of dying. They are doing everything they possibly can to not die. My mother's had cancer in 3 different locations of her body. She gets it ripped out every time. She is petrified of dying. She keeps saying to me whenever I call her, which isn't that often, but whenever I call her, it's like, I just want to live another year. There was a period just a year or so ago, she couldn't walk. She couldn't go outside. She had to have carers come in to care for her. She was so sick and ill. She was on death's door. She had a heart condition while at the same time having cancer. And she just wanted to live another year. Because she doesn't believe in a spirit world. She doesn't believe that when you die you're not dead. Right? Her religion teaches her that when you die you're dead as a doornail. That's what the religion teaches her, and that's what she believes. Right? And so she's doing everything she possibly can just to eke out another few minutes of life. She's very, very worried about about my brother, and has a big, very damaging relationship with him, and very concerned about what's happening in his life, and I won't get into that, but she's so distressed all the time. And do you think she ever cries? She hasn't learnt humility. She can't even let herself cry. Imagine the pain she's in. She's in an immense amount of pain. And she still can't cry. Still can't feel. My father, much the same. He's 82. He's had prostate cancer, had all that removed. He's had so many sicknesses and accidents, particularly accidents. My father is accident prone. Because he's just reckless with his body, he still rides a 900cc motorcycle at 82 years of age, and of course has a lot of struggle with it. So he's still trying to live his life of joy. My dad, but very unhappy, very grumpy all the time. It's like it's funny. We did visit there. Was it 12 months ago?
Yeah, 12 months ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's just so grumpy all the time. As soon as my dad walks out the door as well, my mum starts talking about him. She's so upset. And then when he walks back in the door, she's smiling again. They've been together for 50... They were married when my mother was 16.
60 years, it must be, baby. It was 61.
Yeah. 61 years they've been married.
More, 60.
62 years. Yeah.
No, sorry, 62.
62 years, yeah. They got married because... pregnant with me, right? But 62 years in that unhappy state. And I look at them and go, you don't need to be this unhappy. You don't even need to be here. You know what I mean? The spirit world is there's so much more freedom. Just even when you're in such a terrible state, there's more freedom than that. So and again, what I see, and is exactly what I saw with my first century parents, your belief systems control to a large extent how much fear you have, and therefore control to a large extent how you use your life. Yeah. One more question before we go for lunch.
10 to 2.
10 to 2, is it?
Yeah.
An extended lunch. No, a late lunch, we call it. Yeah, just one more and then we'll go.
Okay, but I had several questions. But the most important is, for me, you're just talking, your mother isn't able to cry. The same for me. So how can I learn it?
Yeah, now these are things we want to discuss tomorrow. Yeah, we want to focus our attention on how to soften up the soul, you know. And we want to focus a bit more of attention tomorrow on the human soul and its attributes and its qualities that you were born with, and then what's happened to them, and then how to recover those attributes and qualities. See, the problem for the majority of us is with our soul is we've been taught, humanity has taught us to detune from the soul, and to become more and more in our mind, you know. And this same process happened to me in this life. Like when I was 33, I was so much in my mind, I didn't know really what a feeling was. I hadn't cried since I was about, properly, you know, since I was about 6 or something. And I'd had a lot of things happen to me during that time that I could have cried about, but I didn't. You know, I didn't even know how to cry, really. I finished up going to get some help in the terms of body worker, and one of the very first things I'd learnt to do there was to cry again. You know what I mean? Like, it was something I just didn't know how to do. So, to be frank with you, I was just as tuned as you were, many of you are now. So it's not, you know, it's not what do you call it? Unrecoverable. Irredeemable. That's the beauty of the soul. You can recover from it. So we need to, you know, maybe talk about, firstly, some theories about that, you know, the soul and honouring emotion and things like that. But also maybe we need to talk a little bit about what you do in practice to have a bit of a breakthrough as well. Like what can you do to soften up and get yourself to be more reflective about the feelings you have. Yeah. So that's all part of our discussion tomorrow, hopefully. Yeah. Good. Well, let's have something to eat, shall we?
Alex? I just asked at the reception if we can sit outside, even if we eat our own stuff, and we can do that.
We can do that.